4th Panzer Army, for its own part, was duly able to cope with this threat on its northern flank. By 14th of January, 1st Panzer Army had completed its withdrawal movement, having been able to speed it up after all in the meantime. It now had its left wing established on a line running from Cherkassk to Petrovskoye. This meant that at least a measure of operational cooperation was now possible between 1st and 4th Panzer armies, even if a wide gap still yawned between Petrovskoye and Proletarskaya. This admittedly was partly covered by the mudflats of the Manich. The first part of 4th Panzer Army's task, which had been to keep the rear of Army Group A free in the area south of the Don, was thus fulfilled. There still remained the second part, that of holding open this Army Group's lines of communication through Rostov. In the face of the enemy's many times greater strength, the accomplishment of the second part was complicated by the fact that 1st Panzer Army was initially to remain several days in the line it had reached in order to prepare the further evacuation of its rear areas. Indeed, 4th Panzer Army's task was to come dangerously near to not being fulfilled at all, for even now Hitler could still not make up his mind to abandon the Caucasus entirely. The question of whether 1st Panzer Army was to be pulled back onto the northern bank of the Don, or whether the whole of Army Group A should remain in the Kuban, still hung in the balance. While 4th Panzer Army was carrying out its task south of the Don during the first half of January, Army Detachment Hollet had a no less difficult job to do in the large bend of the river. As was stated in the chapter on Stalingrad, the enemy had spent the past few weeks making repeated attacks in infinitely superior strength on the Army Detachment's front along the Chir. At General Hollet's disposal, on a front extending some 125 miles from the Don at Nizhny-Chirskaya as far as Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, were, and this included the Meath Group, now under command, 4 infantry divisions, 62, 294, 336 and 387, which had already been very badly worn down in the fighting to date. Also helping to hold the front were some alarm units, and, a valuable buttress, these, anti-aircraft units commanded by the seasoned General Stahel. As for the Army Detachment's 2 Luftwaffe field divisions, what little was left of them inevitably had to be incorporated into army formations. The main strength of the Army Detachment was constituted by 6 and 11 Panzer divisions, augmented by the newly arrived 7 Panzer. The badly battered 22 Panzer Division had to be disbanded. With these forces, General Hollet had to prevent the enemy in the north from moving down on the lower reaches of the Don, i.e. into the rear of 4th Panzer Army, and, most important of all, from breaking through to Rostov for as long as 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A were in the area south of the Don. Furthermore, it was the Army Detachment's job to see that the enemy opposite its left wing did not push through to the Donets crossings between Forchstadt and Voroshilovgrad, thereby opening the way to Rostov from the northwest. At the same time, however, the Army Detachment found itself threatened on both flanks, in the west as a result of the disappearance from the battlefield of the Italians, in whose place the Fretta-Pico group was slowly fighting its way back from the Milerovo region towards the Donets, and in the east because several enemy army corps now had crossed the Don, first at Potemkinskaya and then at Tsimlianskaya. They could only be stopped, as was noted earlier, by throwing in N Panzer Division and bending the Meath Group back onto a front facing east from behind the Kagalnik. Like 4th Panzer Army, Army Detachment Hollet reflected firm yet versatile leadership in mastering its task amid heavy fighting and incessant crises. Here too, however, the Army Group assumed ultimate responsibility by ordering it, at great, if not immediate, risk to the spots thus laid bare, to bunch its armour together for short offensive thrusts. The fact that the Army Detachment succeeded in finally halting the enemy on the Donets, and thereby in saving 4th Panzer Army and Army Group A from being cut off south of the Don, must be ascribed first and foremost, while not forgetting the way its staff handled operations, to the bravery with which the infantry divisions and all other formations and units helping to hold the line stood their ground against the enemy's recurrent attacks. Yet their defence could never have been maintained had not our armoured divisions time and again shown up at danger spots at just the right moment. On one hand, they intervened to ward off the impending encirclement of the army detachment's right wing as it wheeled back onto the Kogalnik, and later to intercept a threatened breakthrough in that sector. On the other, they surprised the enemy by driving straight into his assembly positions as he was about to attack the army detachment's northern front forward of the Donets. While it was the business of the army detachment itself to mount such close counterblows as part of its defensive role, the actual responsibility for risking them usually lay with the army group. The latter had to relieve the army detachment of responsibility for any emergencies which might arise whenever, on army group instructions, it concentrated its armour in one spot and thereby imperilled the remaining sectors of the front. By the middle of January 1943, the operational situation on the southern wing of the Eastern Front had come to a head. Its seeds had been laid in the late autumn of 1942, when our military command had allowed the front to solidify into a line which was operationally untenable from a long-term point of view. What had clearly been shaping up since Christmas week 1942, when the last opportunity for Sixth Army to break out was missed, had now come to pass. Only the desperate struggle waged by the German fighting troops and command staffs had so far staved off an even worse crisis. Sixth Army was doomed. The best it could do now, with what little strength it still possessed, was to render its comrades in the Don Bend and the Caucasus the last supreme service of tying down strong enemy forces for just a short while longer. It was clear that after the loss of Sixth Army, the Caucasus region could not even be held on a reduced scale. Now, however, thanks to the doggedness and dexterity with which 4th Panzer Army had been fighting in the area south of the Don, there was at least a chance that when the Caucasus went, Army Group A need not be lost with it. Its eastern wing, which had been in the greatest danger of all, was now safely retracted, and even though 1st Panzer Army was still 190 miles from the river crossing at Rostov, it was nonetheless out of the mountains and no longer threatened from the rear. If things came to the worst, it could fight its own way back from now on. In the area between the Don and Donets, it had so far been possible to deny the enemy access to Rostov and prevent him from closing the trap from the north behind the three armies standing south of the lower arm of the Don. But it was evident that neither Army Detachment Hollet nor the Freta Pico Group, now fighting around Milarovo and consisting of HQ 30 Corps with 3 mountain and 304 infantry divisions under command, could prevent the enemy from crossing the Donets upstream from Kamensk-Shakhtinsky once he was strong enough to reach so far round to the west. From then on, he would be at liberty to drive on Rostov from the northwest or straight down to the Sea of Azov. Worst of all, about this time the Army Group B sector held by the Hungarian army on the Middle Don collapsed before a fresh enemy offensive. The connecting front in the north was also caught up in the disaster. Army Group B wanted to take its forces back behind the Adar as far up as Starobielsk, which meant leaving open the Donets downstream from Voroshilovgrad. For all practical purposes, however, this wing of the army group was to cease to exist within a few days. A wide gap opened up from Voroshilovgrad to the north, in which only isolated German battle groups of Army Group B were offering desperate local resistance. The Hungarians, like the Italians, had disappeared from the battlefield. It seemed certain that OKH could not hope to plug this hole with the reserves now on the way. In any case, as far as Don Army Group was concerned, the time had obviously come to leapfrog strong forces from the area south of the Don to the Middle Donets if the enemy were to be prevented from tying off Don Army Group and Army Group A. The German Supreme Command still did not agree, however. Either it was unable to foresee what turn events would inevitably take if nothing effective were done to make us strong in the crucial area between the Donets and Lower Dnieper, or it simply would not see the dangers of the situation. Hitler was still not disposed to give up the Caucasus region. He still thought he could somehow maintain a front south of the Don, which would at least safeguard his possession of the Maikop oil fields. His minimum requirement was the retention of an extensive bridgehead in the Kuban from which he proposed at a later date to renew his grab for the Caucasus oil. And so, in the weeks that followed, our army group was compelled to continue its desperate struggle on both sides of the Don in the interest of a systematic withdrawal of Army Group A. All this time it was having a fierce dispute with the Supreme Command over the idea of leapfrogging forces to the Donetsk area. This concerned not only the acceptability of the principle as such, but also the question as to how many of Army Group A's forces should be brought back through Rostov to the decisive battleground. To tie up substantial elements of Army Group A in a Kuban bridgehead amounted, in our opinion, to sheer wishful thinking from the point of view of operations as a whole. By 14th January, the day on which 1st Panzer Army reached the line Cherkask-Petrovskoye and established a front facing eastwards, another crisis was brewing in the area of Army Detachment Holit. On that day, an enemy tank corps succeeded in breaking through towards the Donets on the right wing of Army Group B, in the area of the Freta-Pico Group, south of Milerovo. Although OKH provided the group with a new infantry division, 302, this alone could not possibly suffice to stabilize the situation on the river. When, on 16th of January, OKH placed the Freta-Pico Group under command of Don Army Group, while simultaneously extending the latter's front to the Aidar, it was still not even certain whether the group would get back behind the Donets at all. It had meanwhile emerged that the enemy intended to throw 3 or 4 mechanized corps against the Donets on either side of Kamensk-Shakhtinsky in the Freta-Pico Group's own area. Fortunately, thanks to a neat success scored a few days previously by Army Detachment Holit, when 2 of its armoured divisions had struck a surprise blow on the Kalitva, an enemy attack had been wiped out there while still in the preparation stage. We therefore ordered the army detachment to execute its planned withdrawal into the Donetsk positions in such a way as to have an armoured division available at the earliest possible moment for mobile defence of the Donetsk sector of Fortstadt-Kamensk. For operations in the newly acquired Kamensk-Voroshilovgrad sector of the river, however, there was nothing to hand, except for the Italians who had streamed back there as stragglers. In other words, there was a danger that Don Army Group's Donetsk front would shortly be outflanked to the west. At the same time, it became evident that the enemy intended to envelop Army Detachment Holit from the east as well. In the gap between its right wing, where the Donets joined the Don, and 4th Panzer Army, which was still having to cover 1st Panzer Army's northern flank against a far superior enemy forward of Salsk on the Manish, 2 enemy corps were identified in the angle between the Sal, Don and Manish. These could be expected to attempt to cross the Don for an advance on Rostov, or else to thrust into the rear of Army Detachment Holit's Donetsk positions. Don Army Group accordingly proposed that it now be allowed to shift 4th Panzer Army over to its western wing, while leaving 1 division temporarily forward of Rostov to keep the crossing open for 1st Panzer Army. This would naturally have necessitated OKH's issuing simultaneous orders for the withdrawal of Army Group A, with 1st Panzer Army moving back on Rostov and 17th Army into the Kuban. Once again, it was impossible to get a quick decision from Hitler. Neither would he countenance the Army Group's proposal that Army Group A's armoured divisions be concentrated in the area of 4th Panzer Army for a short offensive stroke to facilitate 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal and thereby to speed up the release of 4th Panzer Army. Not until 18th of January did OKH finally concede 4th Panzer Army freedom of movement, to the extent that the latter no longer had to cover the northern flank of 1st Panzer Army on the Manik northeastwards of Salsk. On the other hand, Don Army Group still had to safeguard Army Group A's use of the Rostov-Tikhorets railway line until 88 supply trains had passed safely through to stock up the Kuban bridgehead. Whether 1st Panzer Army would now be withdrawn towards Rostov or into the Kuban was still anybody's guess. The time being taken to decide whether to allow forces to be leapfrogged westwards inside the German southern wing could only benefit the enemy, of course. It enabled him to exploit the collapse of the Italian and Hungarian sectors of Army Group B's front and to assemble powerful forces with which to advance over the Middle Donets towards the coast of the Sea of Azov or the Dnieper crossings. forces to which, for the moment, we had nothing to offer in the way of opposition. The enemy was also given opportunity to concentrate his formations for a direct assault on Rostov and to envelop Army Detachment Holit's western wing through Voroshilovgrad. On 20th January, the enemy in the area of 4th Panzer Army launched an attack over the lower Manich towards Rostov, with 4 corps he had concentrated for this purpose. His tanks reached the Rostov airfield, though 16 Panzer Division, which 4th Panzer Army had thrown over to this northern wing, had been delaying the enemy's progress between the Don and Manich by repeated thrusts into his flank from the southern bank of the latter. It had naturally been unable to halt all 4 corps on its own. By simultaneously attacking the Army's 57 Panzer Corps, which was now gradually falling back on Rostov from the middle Manich, the enemy endeavoured to detain 4th Panzer Army's main forces forward of Rostov until he had possession of the Rostov crossing in their rear. Furthermore, the enemy was hitting hard at the front of Army Detachment Holit. Here, too, he obviously aimed to pin down our forces until he had encircled them by the capture of Rostov and an envelopment movement across the middle Donets. By launching these attacks against General Meath's corps in the angle between the Don and Donets, as well as on either side of Kamensk, he was presumably also trying to prevent the release of any forces from this front, which could be thrown against him on the middle Donets. Once again, the army group's problem was which threat to tackle first. 2 armoured divisions, 7 and 11 Panzer, were standing by in Army Detachment Holit's area to be switched to the western wing on the middle Donets. But however great the danger there might become in the long run, the army group felt it was even more urgent at this moment to avert the threat to Rostov. Everything possible had to be done to get not only 4th, but at least the whole of 1st Panzer Army back through the city. Otherwise, there would not be the slightest prospect of ever assembling sufficient forces on the army group's western wing to counteract the danger of the entire southern wings being surrounded on the seacoasts. For this reason, Don Army Group resolved that, in order to prevent the capture of Rostov, the 2 above-named armoured divisions should in the first instance be used to deliver a sharp blow at the enemy attacking over the lower Manich in the direction of the city. However, because of petrol shortage, all the supply trains at that time were going to the Kuban bridgehead by way of Rostov, and the impossibility of obtaining air support for our attack under the prevailing weather conditions, this counterblow took longer to effect than was admissible in the existing situation. For time was pressing more and more. Since 6th Army's resistance was now coming to an end, we had to expect to have most of the enemy's Stalingrad forces about our ears within 2 or 3 weeks. I had already told General Zeitzler on 22nd January that I should not be surprised to see them turn up in the Starobielsk area, i.e., in the broad gap between Don Army Group and Army Group B. The same day, Hitler finally decided that a part, at least, of 1st Panzer Army should not be taken into the Kuban bridgehead, but be brought back through Rostov, that is, into what was later to be the decisive battleground. This, though only a compromise solution in our own eyes, was nonetheless welcome in the sense of the Army Group's own conception of operations. It was, however, of the utmost importance that this withdrawal should be performed at maximum speed, so that 4th Panzer Army, in its turn, could be transferred to the Army Group's western wing at the earliest possible moment. The rapidity of 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal through Rostov depended entirely on the ability of Army Group A's other components to adapt their speed of movement accordingly. Yet it was clear that even now the Army Group was still unable to increase its speed to the extent the situation demanded. I have never been able to elicit a satisfactory reason for this. At all events, 1st Panzer Army maintained after coming under my command that had it not been repeatedly halted on instructions from above, it could in fact have moved much more smartly from the very start. Both Army Group A and OKH disputed this. Whatever the answer, the fact remains that Army Group A had so timed the move of its left wing, which was still around Belaya Glina, 30 miles east of Tikhorets on 23rd of January, that it would not reach Tikhorets until 1st February. On 23rd January, Don Army Group came into another legacy. this time the southern part of Army Group B's front between the Donets and Starobielsk. As usual, the liabilities far outweighed everything else. They consisted of about 40 extra miles of front and at least 3 enemy corps now on the advance in that sector, one of them armoured and the other mechanized. The only asset we acquired, now that the Italians could no longer be counted upon, was 19 Panzer Division, at that moment located around Starobielsk. The very next day, however, it was forced to yield Starobielsk to the enemy. It was an exceptional achievement on the part of this valiant division, so outstandingly led by Lieutenant General Postel, that it was ever able to fight a way through to the west at all. The enemy's action in swinging south across the Donets was something it could not prevent. On 24th of January, Hitler decided that if possible the whole of 1st Panzer Army should be withdrawn through Rostov from now on. Since its southern wing was still at Armavir, this naturally meant tying down 4th Panzer Army south of the Don even longer in order to keep Rostov open. Whether the army could still be thrown over to the western wing of the army group in time thus became increasingly doubtful. There were nonetheless 2 gratifying facts to record. Army Group A, which had been understandably reluctant to see one of its armies disappear across the Don, had realized after all that its own fate too would be decided on the Donets and not in the Kuban. Besides, it was becoming more and more unlikely that a force of any strength in the Kuban could be supplied across the Straits of Kerch. Henceforth, Army Group A, as well, came out in favour of withdrawing the largest possible number of forces through Rostov. The second fact was that on 25th of January, the above-mentioned attack of 2 of our armoured divisions on the enemy advancing across the lower Manich finally produced the success we had hoped for. With that, the immediate threat to the Rostov crossings was eliminated for the time being. Instead, the situation on 4th Panzer Army's southern wing took another critical turn. Bringing up fresh forces, which appeared to have been drawn from the Soviet armies pressing after Army Group A, the enemy attempted to get between 4th Panzer Army and the northern wing of 1st Panzer Army in order to envelop the former from the south and force the latter away from Rostov. Don Army Group accordingly presented Army Group A with a final demand that it should join in this battle with an armoured division and also step up 1st Panzer Army's withdrawal on Rostov with every means at its disposal. At last, on 27th of January, at least the northern half of 1st Panzer Army came under the command of Don Army Group, with the result that the latter was now itself able to order the measures to which I have just referred. At the same time, since 4th Panzer Army still had to keep the Rostov crossing open for the time being, Don Army Group decided that HQ, 1st Panzer Army, which could be released sooner south of the Don, should be the first to move over to the Middle Donets. It was to be followed there by its divisions as they were fed through Rostov, as well as by forces of 4th Panzer Army as they became available. By 31st January, things had reached a point where 1st Panzer Army could be expected to come back through Rostov, though whether it would arrive at the Donets in time to stop the enemy breaking across the river to the seacoast was quite another matter. The unfortunate thing was that even now not all of the army's formations could be got to the decisive battleground. Thanks to Hitler's hesitation in deciding whether to bring the army back towards Rostov or to move it into the Kuban, 50 Division, one of the well-tried formations of the former Crimean Army, had not been in time to join in the move to Rostov and had gone over to 17th Army. Furthermore, after days of indecision, Hitler at the last moment reallocated 13 Panzer Division to Army Group A for use in the Kuban after we had striven to the last to preserve a gap through which to slip it to Rostov. Thus, both these divisions were withheld from the crucial battleground, while some 400,000 men lay virtually paralysed in the Kuban. Admittedly, the latter served to tie down the powerful enemy forces who were vainly striving to do away with the bridgehead. But they never achieved the operational effect which Hitler sought, and ultimately the enemy was left free to decide what size of force he should leave there. Not even Hitler's argument that a large force must be kept in the Kuban in order to deny the enemy the naval port of Novorossiysk held any water. He still had to give it up in the end. On 29th of January, our headquarters moved from Taganrog, where it had gone on the 12th, to Stalino, as the army group's main point of effort now had to shift from the Don to the Donets. During the battles in and south of the large bend of the Don, the aim of which had been to cover the withdrawal of Army Group A from the Caucasus, but in which the larger issue was whether the German southern wing could be preserved at all, a fresh problem was already emerging. The question was whether this southern wing would be able to maintain the Donets area. This area, which lies between the Sea of Azov, the Don estuary, and the lower and middle Donets, and is roughly bounded in the west by the line Mariupol-Krasnoarmyskoye Isium, had played a fundamental part in Hitler's operational calculations as far back as 1941, for he considered possession of it to be of vital importance to the outcome of the war. On the one hand, he contended that we should not get through the war economically without its vast coal deposits, while on the other, he considered that the loss of these had dealt a telling blow to the Soviet war effort. Donets coal, he declared, was the only kind the Russians had, at least in European Russia, that was suitable for coking, and sooner or later the lack of it must paralyse their tank and munitions production. While I do not propose to discuss the pros and cons of these assertions, the fact remains that the Russians managed to produce thousands of tanks and millions of shells in the years 1942-3 without recourse to this Donets coal. The real question was whether we could remain the military masters of the Donets basin or not. From the point of view of our war economy, it was unquestionably desirable that we should retain it, with the one qualification that while we extracted substantial quantities of Donets coal for our own use, all the bunker coal for the railway supplying this vast territory had to be brought out from Germany because Donets coal did not suit our locomotives. As the Reichsbahn had to run several coal trains a day to cover its own requirements, the proportion of troop trains fell off accordingly. Be that as it may, Hitler maintained that the German war economy could not possibly do without the Donets basin. A year later, he said exactly the same thing about the manganese output of Nikopol. And yet our possession of the area was in doubt from the moment the Hungarian front collapsed south of Voronezh, throwing open the enemy's road to the Donets and across it to the Dnieper crossings, or the Sea of Azov. The first time the question of our fighting to hold the Donets basin came up was in a telephone conversation I had with General Zeitzler on 19th of January. He wanted to hear my views on the subject, having broached it to Hitler, albeit without success, the day before. This was the day on which the danger appeared of a breach in the whole front from Voroshilovgrad to Voronezh. I told Zeitzler that however important this area might be, even from the economic point of view, the question was relatively simple to answer. If it were to be retained in its entirety, strong forces must be assembled with a minimum delay and as far east as was feasible, forward of Kharkov, if possible. Should we be unable to do this because it was thought that Central and Northern Army groups could not spare any more forces, because the new drafts at home were not ready, because OKW would not release any forces from other fronts, or finally because such a sudden deployment would be too much for the railways in their present state, we should simply have to accept the consequences. The southern wing of the German armies could not close the gap with its own forces if it remained on the lower Don. Nor could it go on fighting there in isolation if the expected reinforcements took a long time to arrive and deployed far to the rear, i.e. out of all relation to the operations of the southern wing. The battle being fought by the southern wing and the deployment of the new forces must be so attuned to one another in a spatial sense as to become operationally coherent. Either the new forces must be made to deploy swiftly and relatively far to the east, in which case it would be possible for the army group to remain on the lower Don and Donets, or else they could not, and the army group would have to be pulled back to join them. If one of these two courses were not taken, the enemy would have an opportunity to cut off the whole southern wing before any reinforcements could make their presence felt. General Zeitzler agreed with me. It was certain in any case that the SS Panzer Corps due to assemble around Kharkov by the middle of February would not have the necessary strength to close the gap now being torn open from Voroshilovgrad to Voronezh. nor could it be made operational in time to launch an offensive thrust north of the Donets for the purpose of freeing the flank of the southern wing in the event of its remaining on the lower Don and Donets. The next few days served to increase the Army Group's alarm at the trend of events in its deep flank. As early as 20th January, we had noticed 2 enemy corps trying to outflank the Army Group's left wing, the Freta-Pico Group at Kamensk, by a movement in the direction of Voroshilovgrad. At the same time, the enemy was feeling his way forward against the Italian remnants behind the Donets east of Voroshilovgrad. Otherwise, his main forces apparently aimed to drive west on Starobielsk in the first instance, obviously with the object of gaining some initial elbow room. As soon as the enemy had attained these aims, however, it could be assumed that he would not only strive to envelop the Freta-Pico Group, but also, by throwing strong forces further round to the west, to advance over the Donets towards the Dnieper crossings or the coast of the Sea of Azov. Only 4 days later, on 24th of January, there were already reports of enemy cavalry south of the Donets in the region of Voroshilovgrad, though it was always possible that a false alarm had been sounded by some jumpy town major in a rear area. On 31st January, I sent OKH a teleprinter message restating my views on the problem of holding the Donets Basin. The prior condition for retaining it, I said, was that a timely attempt be made from the direction of Kharkov to relieve the pressure on us, and that the enemy in the area northeast of the city be beaten before the muddy season set in. If, as unfortunately seemed to be the case, neither of these should prove practicable, there would be no possibility of holding the basin, at least not to its full extent in the east. Any attempt to remain on the lower Don and Donets would thus be a mistake from the operational point of view. A second factor which must not be overlooked, I went on, was that our present forces would not alone suffice to hold the whole Donets area if, as seemed certain, the enemy were to bring up further reinforcements from the Caucasus and Stalingrad. It was just not good enough to pin one's hopes on the enemy's becoming exhausted, great though his losses might well have been in attacks on German troops, or on his operations being brought to a premature halt by difficulties of supply. These were the arguments which Hitler constantly produced to General Zeitzler whenever the latter drew his attention, on the strength of the basically accurate intelligence reports he received from us, to the tremendous numerical superiority of the enemy. Undoubtedly there was some justification for what Hitler said, yet it had to be borne in mind that the enemy's attacks on Allied armies had cost him very little, and that he was far less dependent on supply and transport than we Germans were in enemy territory. The very next few days confirmed the Army Group's appreciation of the enemy's intentions. It became clear that he was out to crush our front on the Donets, and simultaneously to outflank us to the west. On 2nd February, he crossed the Donets east of Voroshilovgrad, without encountering any serious opposition from the Italians there. The assault group he had assembled consisted of 3 tank corps, 1 mechanized and 1 rifle corps, obviously part of the forces which had previously overrun the Italians on the Don. The objectives of this grouping could be taken to be Rostov or Taganrog. After ejecting 19 Panzer Division from Starobielsk, the enemy had swung another strong force of 3 or 4 tank corps and a rifle corps southwest against the line Slaviansk, Lysychansk. It was plain that he planned a movement to outflank our wing further west. This, if one ignored the residue of Italians, he could expect to find around or even east of Voroshilovgrad. Except for the measures the Army Group was able to take in its own sphere of command, with the ultimate object of flinging 1st Panzer Army over to the Middle Donets. Therefore, the period following the end of January was taken up with wrangles between the Army Group and OKH on how to proceed with the operations as a whole. As has been stated, I had already emphasized to General Zeitzler on 19th of January that the whole of the Donets Basin could only be held on condition that strong forces intervened swiftly and effectively from the Kharkov direction. As no prospect of this existed, I asked for permission to reduce the echeloning of our eastern wing at least far enough to release the forces which the Army Group would need if it were to prevent the amputation of the southern wing with its own resources and the reinforcements it had been promised. We had already dispatched 1st Panzer Army to the Middle Donets to counteract the threat of envelopment that had now become acute there. What had to be done now was to get 4th Panzer Army too, out of the balcony on the lower Don and Donets. This was the only timely way to meet the danger of an enemy attempt to cut us off from the Dnieper crossings by advancing across the Isium-Slaviansk line. Further up the Don, moreover, the enemy must always be expected to bring even more troops over the river towards the lower Dnieper than had already been reported at Slaviansk. Apart from 1st Division of the SS Panzer Corps, which had meanwhile arrived at Kharkov, there were nothing but battered remnants to oppose him anywhere in the area of Army Group B. These alone could not prevent him from wheeling into our deep flank. But 4th Panzer Army could only be released if a considerable reduction were made in the length of the Army Group front. Instead of continuing to hold the extensive arc formed by the lower Don and the Donets from Rostov as far as the region west of Voroshilovgrad, the right wing of the Army Group must be taken back, as it were, onto the string of the bow. This string was the system of defences which the German southern wing had held in 1941 after the first withdrawal from Rostov. A line running behind the Mius and continuing northwards as far as the Middle Donets. Taking the front back into this position naturally meant abandoning the eastern part of the Donets coalfields. In order to justify this withdrawal, I made an attempt to bring home my conception of the long-term conduct of military operations to the Supreme Command. The following is roughly how I expressed it in a teleprinter message addressed for Hitler's personal attention. To hold the Don Donets salient for any length of time was not possible, even in a purely defensive context, with the forces at the Army Group's disposal. In the event of the Supreme Command's having to remain on the defensive in 1943 on account of the loss of 6th Army and its 20 divisions, an all-out attempt to defend the entire Donets Basin would mean committing all the forces there that could possibly be made available. That, however, would give the enemy a free hand to take the offensive with far superior forces at any point he cared to pick on the remainder of the front. While the present danger was that Don Army Group would be bottled up on the Sea of Azov, and Army Group A consequently lost in the Kuban, we could safely assume that even if this could be avoided and the whole Donets area held, the enemy's later aim would be to encircle the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front on the Black Sea. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Command felt able to seek a solution by renewed offensive action in 1943, it could again only do so on the southern wing, but on no account from out of the Don Donets salient because of the now familiar supply difficulties and the flanking threat to which any attack from this balcony projection would be exposed from the outset. The only means of achieving an offensive solution, always assuming that this were in the least feasible, consisted in the first place in drawing the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper on our southern wing. Having once achieved this, we had to launch a powerful attack from the Kharkov area and smash the Russian front connecting there in order to turn south and surround the enemy on the Sea of Azov. Hitler, however, was apparently unwilling to entertain any ideas of this kind. He had already been told by Zeitzler himself, so the latter informed me, that the only question now was whether to abandon the Donets area by itself or to lose Don Army Group along with it. Hitler's answer had been that although his chief of staff was probably right from the operational point of view, the surrender of the Donets area was impossible for economic reasons, not so much because of any loss of coal to ourselves, as because a German withdrawal would put the enemy back in possession of the supplies so vital to his own steel production. As an interim solution, Hitler had directed that the SS Reich Division, the first of the SS Panzer Corps formations to have reached Kharkov, should launch a thrust from that area into the rear of the enemy forces advancing against our Donets front. Quite apart from the fact that this solitary division could never suffice for such a far-ranging operation, it would have had to overrun 6 enemy divisions for a start, and that there would be nothing available to cover its ever-lengthening northern flank, its commitment to battle would have meant splitting up the only striking force, the SS Panzer Corps, which could be expected to join us in the foreseeable future. If it came to that, the Reich Division was no longer free for such an operation, Army Group B having already had to throw it in to meet the rapid advance of the Soviets towards Kharkov. At that very hour it was tied up in a pretty unpromising defensive action at Volchansk, northeast of the city. During the next couple of days, 4th and 5th February, the situation on Don Army Group's front deteriorated visibly, the enemy bringing sharp pressure to bear on 4th Panzer Army as it covered the flow of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov. Two armies from his former Caucasus front, 44th and 58th, had now joined the three already facing 4th Panzer Army, a sure sign that the threat which Army Group A's 17th Army in the Kuban was supposed to constitute in the flank of the Russians had not deterred them from transferring substantial forces to the decisive battleground. Before long, Don Army Group would have to expect a massed attack on both Rostov itself and the Don front, each side of Novocherkassk. In addition, a strong motorized force was found to be moving from Stalingrad towards the Don. On the Army Group's left wing, too, the situation was becoming increasingly grave. East of Voroshilovgrad, 6th Panzer Division, which Army Detachment Hollit had rushed up to the Middle Donets in pursuance of the Army Group order of 14th of January, had not succeeded in flinging the enemy back across the river. All it could do for the time being was to bottle him up in the bridgehead he had gained there. Further west, the enemy had been able to cross the Donets on a broad front, there being practically no forces whatever to defend it. He was now outside Slavyansk and had taken Izium. Even now, therefore, it appeared doubtful whether the withdrawal of Army Detachment Hollit into the Mius positions would still be at all feasible. The Army Group had intended to have it on the Novocherkassk-Kamensk line by 5th of January, but in fact it had been tied down on the Don and Donets through Hitler's refusal to let us take the front back to the Mius. If the enemy were to push swiftly southeastwards from Slavyansk, he would unhinge the Mius defences from the start. Even though HQ 1st Panzer Army and the forces we had allocated to it were by this time on the road from Rostov to the Middle Donets, it would inevitably be several days yet before the army could take an effective hand there. What made things worse was that the saturated roads in the coastal area greatly hampered the progress of the armoured divisions, whereas the ground further north was still frozen solid and in no way affected the Russians' mobility. In view of these ominous developments, the Army Group not only renewed its call for an immediate withdrawal of its right wing to the Mius, but also presented OKH with a series of specific demands which were intended to underline the perilousness of the situation. It called for the concentration of 7 AA Division, which was engaged on anti-aircraft defence in the communications zone, to provide both air and ground protection for the supply route running through Dnepropetrovsk. It called for the immediate preparation of an airlift in case the enemy were to cut its rear communications. It called for a ruthless increase in the transport capacity of the railway at the expense of supplies to Army Group B, which had hardly any more troops to feed anyway. It demanded that unless the promised attack by the SS Reich Division had achieved complete success, which must mean reaching Kupiansk, by 6th of February, the SS Panzer Corps should attack south of the Donets towards Isium as soon as the increase in troop trains enabled it to assemble around Kharkov. Finally, the Army Group called for the immediate transfer of the combat troops of 13 Panzer Division and 2 infantry divisions of 17th Army to the lower Dnieper, where they would be furnished with new weapons and take over the B-echelon transport and supply columns of 6th Army located there. Even if Hitler shut his eyes to our more long-term view of operations, these demands would in any case bring the urgency of the position home to him. And sure enough, as a result of this teleprinter message, a Condor aircraft touched down on our airstrip on 6th of February to fetch me to General Headquarters for an interview with Hitler. His decision to give me a personal hearing may have been partially due to a visit paid to us at the end of January by his senior military assistant Schmundt, to whom we had expressed our views very forcibly on the present situation and the way in which things were being handled at the top. While the present danger was that Don Army Group would be bottled up on the Sea of Azov, and Army Group A consequently lost in the Kuban, we could safely assume that even if this could be avoided and the whole Donetsk area held, the enemy's later aim would be to encircle the whole southern wing of the Eastern Front on the Black Sea. If, on the other hand, the Supreme Command felt able to seek a solution by renewed offensive action in 1943, it could again only do so on the southern wing, but on no account from out of the Donetsk salient because of the now familiar supply difficulties and the flanking threat to which any attack from this balcony projection would be exposed from the outset. The only means of achieving an offensive solution, always assuming that this were in the least feasible, consisted in the first place in drawing the enemy westwards towards the lower Dnieper on our southern wing. Having once achieved this, we had to launch a powerful attack from the Kharkov area and smash the Russian front connecting there in order to turn south and surround the enemy on the Sea of Azov. Hitler, however, was apparently unwilling to entertain any ideas of this kind. He had already been told by Seitzler himself, so the latter informed me, that the only question now was whether to abandon the Donetsk area by itself or to lose Don Army Group along with it. Hitler's answer had been that although his chief of staff was probably right from the operational point of view, the surrender of the Donetsk area was impossible for economic reasons, not so much because of any loss of coal to ourselves as because a German withdrawal would put the enemy back in possession of the supplies so vital to his own steel production. As an interim solution, Hitler had directed that the SS Reich Division, the first of the SS Panzer Corps formations to have reached Kharkov, should launch a thrust from that area into the rear of the enemy forces advancing against our Donetsk front. Quite apart from the fact that this solitary division could never suffice for such a far-ranging operation, it would have had to overrun 6 enemy divisions for a start, and that there would be nothing available to cover its ever-lengthening northern flank. Its commitment to battle would have meant splitting up the only striking force, the SS Panzer Corps, which could be expected to join us in the foreseeable future. If it came to that, the Reich Division was no longer free for such an operation, Army Group B having already had to throw it in to meet the rapid advance of the Soviets towards Kharkov. At that very hour, it was tied up in a pretty unpromising defensive action at Volchansk, northeast of the city. During the next couple of days, 4th and 5th February, the situation on Don Army Group's front deteriorated visibly, the enemy bringing sharp pressure to bear on 4th Panzer Army as it covered the flow of 1st Panzer Army through Rostov. 2 armies from his former Caucasus front, 44th and 58th, had now joined the 3 already facing 4th Panzer Army, a sure sign that the threat which Army Group A's 17th Army in the Kuban was supposed to constitute in the flank of the Russians had not deterred them from transferring substantial forces to the decisive battleground. Before long, Don Army Group would have to expect a massed attack on both Rostov itself and the Don front each side of Novocherkassk. In addition, a strong motorized force was found to be moving from Stalingrad towards the Don. On the Army Group's left wing, too, the situation was becoming increasingly grave. East of Voroshilovgrad, 6th Panzer Division, which Army Detachment Hollit had rushed up to the Middle Donetsk in pursuance of the Army Group order of 14th of January, had not succeeded in flinging the enemy back across the river. All it could do for the time being was to bottle him up in the bridgehead he had gained there. Further west, the enemy had been able to cross the Donetsk on a broad front, there being practically no forces whatever to defend it. He was now outside Slavyansk and had taken Isium. Even now, therefore, it appeared doubtful whether the withdrawal of Army Detachment Hollit into the Mius positions would still be at all feasible. The Army Group had intended to have it on the Novocherkassk-Kamensk line by 5th of January, but in fact it had been tied down on the Don and Donetsk through Hitler's refusal to let us take the front back to the Mius. If the enemy were to push swiftly southeastwards from Slavyansk, he would unhinge the Mius defences from the start. Even though HQ 1st Panzer Army and the forces we had allocated to it were by this time on the road from Rostov to the Middle Donetsk, it would inevitably be several days yet before the army could take an effective hand there. What made things worse was that the saturated roads in the coastal area greatly hampered the progress of the armoured divisions, whereas the ground further north was still frozen solid and in no way affected the Russians' mobility. In view of these ominous developments, the army group not only renewed its call for an immediate withdrawal of its right wing to the Meuse, but also presented OKH with a series of specific demands which were intended to underline the perilousness of the situation. It called for the concentration of 7th LA Division, which was engaged on anti-aircraft defence in the communications zone, to provide both air and ground protection for the supply route running through Dnipropetrovsk. It called for the immediate preparation of an airlift in case the enemy were to cut its rear communications. It called for a ruthless increase in the transport capacity of the railway at the expense of supplies to Army Group B, which had hardly any more troops to feed anyway. It demanded that unless the promised attack by the SS Reich Division had achieved complete success, which must mean reaching Kupiansk, by 6th of February, the SS Panzer Corps should attack south of the Donets towards Isium as soon as the increase in troop trains enabled it to assemble around Kharkov. Finally, the army group called for the immediate transfer of the combat troops of 13 Panzer Division and 2 infantry divisions of 17th Army to the lower Dnieper, where they would be furnished with new weapons and take over the B-echelon transport and supply columns of 6th Army located there. Even if Hitler shut his eyes to our more long-term view of operations, these demands would in any case bring the urgency of the position home to him. And sure enough, as a result of this teleprinter message, a Condor aircraft touched down on our airstrip on 6th February to fetch me to General Headquarters for an interview with Hitler. His decision to give me a personal hearing may have been partially due to a visit paid to us at the end of January by his senior military assistant Schmundt, to whom we had expressed our views very forcibly on the present situation and the way in which things were being handled at the top. The conference of 6th of February 1943 between Hitler and myself made it possible to forestall the disaster threatening to overtake the German southern wing and to give the Supreme Command one more chance at least to obtain a stalemate in the east. Hitler opened the talks, as I have already reported in the chapter on Stalingrad, with an unqualified admission of his exclusive responsibility for the fate of 6th Army, which had met its tragic end a few days previously. At the time, I had the impression that he was deeply affected by this tragedy, not just because it amounted to a blatant failure of his own leadership, but also because he was deeply depressed in a purely personal sense by the fate of the soldiers who, out of faith in him, had fought to the last with such courage and devotion to duty. Yet later on I came to doubt whether Hitler had any place whatever in his heart for the soldiers who put such boundless trust in him and remained true to him till the end. By then I wondered if he did not regard all of them, from field marshal down to private soldier, as mere tools of his war aims. Be that as it may, this gesture of Hitler's in assuming immediate and unqualified responsibility for Stalingrad struck a chivalrous note. Whether deliberately or unconsciously, he had thus shown considerable psychological skill in the way he opened our discussion. He always did have a masterly knack of adapting his manner to his interlocutor. For my own part, I had made up my mind to discuss 2 questions with him. The first was that of the future conduct of operations in my own area, which depended on getting Hitler's consent to the abandonment of the eastern part of the Donets Basin. It was essential to elicit this from him that very day. The second question I wished to bring up was that of the Supreme Command, i.e. the form in which it had been exercised by Hitler ever since the dismissal of Field Marshal Brauchitsch. The outcome of this style of leadership, Stalingrad, gave me adequate reason for raising it. To dispose of the second question first, let me say quite briefly that no satisfactory conclusion was reached. Realizing that a dictator like Hitler would never bring himself to resign as Commander-in-Chief, I tried to get him to accept a solution which would not damage his prestige and yet guarantee a salutary military leadership for the future. I asked him to ensure the uniformity of this leadership by appointing one Chief of Staff whom he must trust implicitly, and at the same time vest with the appropriate responsibility and authority. But Hitler was clearly not willing to treat the matter impartially. He kept resorting to the personal aspects of the case, complaining of the disappointments he had suffered with Verse Blomberg, the war minister, and even with Verbrauchitsch. He quite bluntly declared, moreover, that he could not possibly put anyone in a position that would virtually set him above Göring, who would never subordinate himself to the guidance of a chief of staff, even if the latter were acting in Hitler's name. Whether Hitler was really reluctant to offend Göring, or merely used this as a pretext, I cannot say. This brings us back to the first question, that of the future of operations in the area of Don Army Group. I began by giving Hitler a picture of the Army Group's present situation and went on to list the conclusions to be drawn from it. I pointed out that our forces would on no account suffice to hold the area of the Don and Donets. However highly Hitler cared to rate its value to either side, the only real question was whether, in trying to hang on to the whole of the Donets basin, we wanted to lose the latter plus Don Army Group, and in due course Army Group A as well, or whether, by abandoning part of it at the right moment, we could avert the catastrophe that threatened to overtake us. Passing on from these manifest aspects of the present situation, I endeavoured to make Hitler see what would inevitably happen later if we persisted in remaining in the Don Donets balcony. The enemy would be free, now that Army Group B was almost completely out of action, to turn the strong forces advancing through the latter's area down towards the lower Dnieper or the coast, and thus to cut off the entire southern wing. What happened down on this southern wing, I emphasized, would decide the outcome of the whole war in the east. It was certain that the enemy would continue to draw on his still strong reserves, particularly from around Stalingrad, to ensure that his struggle to slice off the German army's southern wing fully achieved its object. For this reason, no counter-thrust by the SS Panzer Corps could be considered adequate to intercept the wide outflanking movement which the enemy would make. He would be quite powerful enough to carry out this envelopment and screen it off to the west around Kharkov simultaneously. Even the sum total of possible German reinforcements would still not be enough to stop this enemy thrust. It was absolutely essential, therefore, that 1st Panzer Army, now on its way to the Middle Donets, should be immediately followed by 4th Panzer Army to intercept the still not acute but nonetheless inevitable threat of an enemy envelopment between the Donets and Dnieper. Only then would it be possible, in cooperation with the approaching reinforcements, to restore the situation on the German southern wing of the Eastern Front, i.e. the entire stretch of front from the coast of the Sea of Azov to the right wing of Central Army Group. Unless 4th Panzer Army were pulled back from the Lower Don, this would not be possible. Yet to take it away from there automatically implied withdrawing from the Don Donets salient into the Mayos positions along its base. There was not a day to lose over this. Indeed, it was already doubtful, thanks to the delay in taking a decision, whether Army Detachment Hollit, now saddled with the defence of the whole front from the coastline to the Middle Donets, would ever get back to the Mius in time. Consequently, I had to receive permission that very day to give up the eastern part of the Donets area as far as the Mius. This statement of mine, to which, incidentally, Hitler listened with the utmost composure, was followed by a dispute on the Donets Basin issue lasting several hours. Even during the second part of our talks, when I discussed the whole problem of leadership with him in private, Hitler kept coming back to it. As was to be my experience on similar occasions, he avoided any real discussion of what I had to say on operational matters. He did not even try to propound a better plan of his own or to refute the assumptions on which I had based my arguments. Nor did he dispute that the situation would develop in the way I felt bound to anticipate. He treated every statement not bearing directly on the most pressing needs of the moment as sheer hypothesis which might or might not become reality. Now, all considerations of an operational nature are ultimately based, especially when one has lost the initiative to the enemy, on appreciations or hypotheses regarding the course of action which the enemy may be expected to take. While no one can prove beforehand that a situation will develop in such and such a way, the only successful military commander is the one who can think ahead. He must be able to see through the veil in which the enemy's future actions are always wrapped, at least to the extent of correctly judging the possibilities open to both the enemy and himself. The greater one's sphere of command, of course, the further ahead one must think, and the greater the distances to be covered and the formations to be moved, the longer is the interval that must elapse before the decision one has taken can produce tangible results. This long-term thinking was not to Hitler's taste, however, at least not in the operational field. Possibly he disliked the prospect of being confronted with conclusions which did not conform to his wishes. Since these could not be refuted, he avoided becoming involved in them wherever possible, and so this time, too, he mainly drew his arguments from other fields. He began by dwelling on his understandable aversion to any voluntary surrender of hard-won territory, so long as it could not be proved, as he thought, that no alternative method existed. It was a viewpoint which every soldier will appreciate. In my own case, particularly, it went right against the grain on this and so many later occasions, to have to goad Hitler into giving territory up. I should have much preferred to be able to submit plans for successful offensives instead of for the now inevitable withdrawals. But it is a well-known maxim of war that whoever tries to hold on to everything at once finishes up by holding nothing at all. Another argument which Hitler kept advancing was that any shortening of the front such as I had proposed for the purpose of making additional forces available would release an equivalent proportion of enemy forces which could then be thrown into the scale at a crucial spot. This in itself was also quite a tenable argument. The constantly decisive factor in any such shift of forces, however, is which of the two opponents gains the lead. In other words, which of them is offered the opportunity, by his own timely action, to seize the initiative at the crucial spot and thereafter to dictate his own terms to the more slow-moving enemy, even when the latter is collectively the stronger. In the case of any attempt to hold the Don Donetsk salient, moreover, the excessive length of the fronts virtually cancelled out the superiority in strength usually enjoyed by a defender over his attacker. In conditions of this kind, the attacker has a chance to pierce the overextended front at a spot of his own choosing, using relatively small forces and suffering no great losses. Since the defence lacks reserves, he is able to demolish the whole structure. Hitler also argued that if one fought bitterly for every foot of ground and made the enemy pay dearly for every step he advanced, even the Soviet army's offensive power must one day be exhausted. The enemy had now been attacking for 2.5 months without a break. His losses were high, and he must soon be at the end of his tether. As he drew further away from his starting lines, moreover, his supply difficulties would halt any far-flung outflanking movement he might be planning. There was certainly a great deal of truth in all that Hitler said. Undoubtedly, the enemy had had very big losses, at least when attacking sectors held by the Germans, and these would have made large inroads on his offensive power. Yet he had had correspondingly easy successes in sectors where there was not the stubborn resistance of German troops to contend with. It was also true that the losses of the Soviet troops, the infantry first and foremost, had greatly lowered their quality, otherwise we could not have held our own against such odds. But however much the enemy division's losses might reduce their combat efficiency, there were always new ones to take their place. As for Soviet supply difficulties, these could indeed be expected to increase the further the enemy's operations took him. But in this age of motor transport, the distances from the army's railheads to the Sea of Azov or the lower Dnieper were not big enough to frustrate the impending Soviet drive to lop off the German southern wing. During World War I, it had still been accepted that no army could normally put more than 95 miles between itself and its railhead. That this figure no longer held good in World War II had been adequately proved by our own operations in both East and West. In addition, the Russians were masters at the rapid reconstruction of railways, which presented relatively few engineering problems on those vast expanses of plain. In any case, it was entirely wrong to base our own measures on the vague hope that the enemy would soon reach the limit of his strength or mobility. When all was said and done, our own divisions, long overtaxed and severely bled, were themselves not far from exhaustion. In this respect, I must emphasize that Hitler was fully aware of the condition and casualties of our own troops. What he did not care to admit was that the newly established divisions initially had to pay far too high a toll in blood on account of their lack of combat experience. On the other hand, he did agree that the Luftwaffe field divisions had proved a fiasco, and even confessed that they had been brought into existence as a concession to Goering's thirst for prestige. All Hitler actually had to say about the operational position was to express the belief that the SS Panzer Corps would be able to remove the acute threat to the Middle Donetsk front by a southeasterly thrust from the Kharkov region in the direction of Isium. His one reservation was that by the time the Corps' 2nd Division, the Leibstandarte, arrived, the Reich Division should have dealt with the enemy at Volchansk. A 3rd Division could not come until later. His faith in the penetrating power of this newly established SS Panzer Corps was apparently unbounded. Otherwise, however, his statements showed that he still did not, or would not, realize the dangers of the less immediate future, especially when the enemy's Stalingrad formations appeared on the new battlefield. But the most decisive argument repeatedly put forward by Hitler was the present impossibility, as he saw it, of giving up the Donetsk area. He feared the repercussions on Turkey, for one thing. Most of all, he stressed the importance of the Donetsk coal to our own war economy, and the effect on the enemy of continuing to be deprived of it. Only by regaining this coal, he said, would the Russians be able to maintain their steel production and thereby keep up their output of tanks, guns, and ammunition. When reminded that they had turned out plenty of tanks and ammunition to date despite having lost the Donetsk basin, Hitler replied that they were simply living off their existing stocks of steel. If they did not get the coal fields back, he insisted, they could not keep up their previous production, which in turn would prevent them from mounting any more big offensives. Now no one would deny that the enemy must be having production trouble in consequence of the loss of the coking coal and the steel and other plant of the Donetsk basin. One proof, in my own opinion, was the fact that he had so far not succeeded in replacing the mass of the artillery he had lost in 1941. It was this which had enabled us to defend the Patchwork Cheer front earlier on. That winter he did in fact have enough guns to commit an overwhelming concentration of them on limited sectors of front, as, for example, during the 3 successive breakthroughs on the Don, but he obviously still had not enough to equip all his divisions with fully mobile artillery. This discussion on the economic importance of the Donetsk area, by the way, gave Hitler an opportunity to display his quite astonishing knowledge of production figures and weapon potentials. In this conflict of views on the advisability or otherwise of trying to hold on to the Donetsk basin, I was ultimately left with only one trump card in my hand. Shortly before my flight to Lützen, we had a visit at my headquarters from Paul Pleiger, president of the Reichsvereinigung Kohle, the German coal cartel. When questioned on the real importance of the Donetsk area to the German and Russian war economies, he had assured me that the mines around Shakti, i.e. in that part of the basin which lay east of the Meuse, were in no way vital, as the coal there was unsuitable for coking or locomotive combustion. This disposed of Hitler's objections from the standpoint of economic warfare. But anyone who supposes that he would now admit his defeat is underestimating the man's pertinacity. As a means at least of delaying the evacuation of the Don Donetsk salient, he finally resorted to the weather. As luck would have it, an unusually early thaw had set in during the last few days. The road across the ice of Taganrog Bay could no longer be used with complete safety, and although the Don and Donetsk were still frozen over, it was always possible that the ice would soon start breaking up if the milder weather continued. Hitler now used all the eloquence at his command to persuade me that in only a few days' time the broad valley of the Don might well be an impassable obstacle over which the enemy could not possibly attack before summer. Conversely, our own 4th Panzer Army would get bogged down in the mud if it moved west. The least I could do in the circumstances, he said, was to wait for a short while longer. When I still would not budge and refused to stake the fate of my army group on the hope of a quite unseasonable change of weather, Hitler finally agreed to the withdrawal of the army group's eastern front to the Meuse. If one included the discussion on the command problem, we had been in conference for 4 whole hours. The extent of Hitler's perseverance is shown by a small thing which happened just after I had taken leave of him. Having given what amounted to final approval of my operational intentions, he called me back again as I was about to leave his room. He said that while he naturally had no wish to alter a decision once it had been agreed upon, he would still urge me to consider just once more whether I could not wait for at least a little longer. A thaw in the Don Basin might even yet enable us to remain in the Don-Donets salient. I still stood firm, however. All I would promise him was not to issue the withdrawal order until I reached my headquarters at noon next day, provided the situation report sent up that evening did not necessitate immediate action. I have given all this space to my interview with Hitler, not only on account of the decisive effect it had on the outcome of the campaign that winter, but also because I find it in many respects typical of his attitude and of the difficulty of getting him to accept anything which did not conform to his own wishes. It would be wrong to suppose, just because we had succeeded, after a long tussle, in obtaining Hitler's agreement to the evacuation of the east of the Donets Basin, which in turn enabled us to throw 4th Panzer Army over to our western wing, that the menace to the German southern wing as a whole was already eliminated. The process of leapfrogging 4th Panzer Army from east to west was bound to take about 2 weeks, in view of the distance involved and the state of the roads. Furthermore, it was by no means certain whether Army Detachment Hollit would reach the Mius positions safely, considering that the enemy in its deep flank around Voroshilovgrad was already south of the Donets. It was still uncertain, moreover, whether 1st Panzer Army could hold or restore to any reasonable extent the front on the Middle Donets. Above all, the situation in the area of Army Group B, i.e. in the region of Kharkov, was shaping so ominously that all sorts of opportunities were opening up to the enemy. Not only could he drive through to the Dnieper crossings at Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye and cut off Don Army Group's communications there, it was even possible for him to cross the river further upstream and block it from the west. Besides shifting 4th Panzer Army over to the western wing of the Army Group, therefore, it would be necessary to form a new grouping of forces to replace Army Group B's Allied armies, which had by now gone almost completely to pieces. At noon on 7th February, I arrived back at my headquarters at Stalin. The situation on the Don had been aggravated by the capture of Bateysk, a suburb of Rostov on the south bank of the river. Immediately upon my return, the Army Group gave orders to fall back behind the Don and began moving HQ 4th Panzer Army, together with whatever divisions it could make available, over to the western wing. Army Detachment Hollit received instructions to retire to the line Novocherkassk, Kamensk in the first instance. On 8th of February, further emergencies arose at Rostov and Voroshilovgrad, where the enemy broke out of the bridgehead he had gained earlier on. The position of 1st Panzer Army, now involved in the fighting on the Middle Donets, was just as critical inasmuch as the success we had hoped it would score against the enemy advancing across the stretch of river between Lysychansk and Slavyansk had so far not materialized. Around Kharkov, in the area of Army Group B, a new army detachment was just being formed under General Lanz. The SS Panzer Corps, which was still in the process of arriving, had been placed under its command. We learnt that the SS Reich Division, which was to have smashed the enemy at Volchansk preparatory to thrusting southeast towards Isium, had in fact come nowhere near doing so. On the contrary, it had retired behind the Donets. In the circumstances, it was certain that nothing would come of the thrust which Hitler had proposed making with the SS Panzer Corps, of which the Reich Division was the only formation so far available, to relieve the pressure on our western flank. On 9th of February, the enemy had taken Belgorod and Kursk in Army Group B's area north of Kharkov. He was also advancing west from the Donets Bend around Isium. In the gap between the Dnieper and the right wing of Central Army Group, which only began some considerable distance north of Kursk, there was practically nothing but Army Detachment Lanz, whose assembly at Kharkov was already imperilled, and Army Group B's badly battered Second Army west of Kursk. In view of the fact that the enemy could now carry out a wide outflanking movement across the Dnieper upstream from Dnipropetrovsk, it was clear that despite the steps taken to shift 4th Panzer Army to the western wing, Don Army Group would in the long run be unable to guarantee the security of its rear communications with its own forces alone. Something radical had to be done. I accordingly sent General Zeitzler a teleprinter message calling for the deployment within the next fortnight of a new army of at least 5 or 6 divisions in the area north of Dnipropetrovsk, as well as of another army behind Second Army's front, i.e. west of Kursk, for a thrust to the south. To do this, I said, there must be a basic improvement in the efficiency of transport, as the slow trickle of divisions which had been coming through to date could not possibly help matters in the present situation. General Zeitzler did hold out the prospect of really effective assistance from now on. He hoped that he could at last release 6 more divisions from Central and Northern Army groups and get these to us faster than had been the case hitherto. The daily number of trains he envisaged was 37, which meant that we could count on having one of the 6 promised divisions every other day. In view of the breadth of the gap torn in the German front, of course, even these forces would be no more than a stopgap to tide us over the worst dangers until the muddy season set in, and whether they would arrive in time depended on developments around Kharkov, on which our own army group had no influence. In any case, the German southern wing remained overshadowed by the mortal danger that either before or immediately after the muddy season the enemy would push through to the Sea of Azov, or, by striking even further west, to the Black Sea. While the army group's deep flank thus constituted its main source of anxiety, the trend of events on its own fronts was also far from encouraging. 1st Panzer Army, Commander General Versa Mackensen, Chief of Staff Colonel Wenck, the task of which was to throw the enemy who had crossed the Middle Donets back across the river, had to contend with 2 superior enemy forces. The first, which had come over the Donets at Voroshilovgrad, was trying to drive in between Army Detachment Holit as it fell back on the Mius and 1st Panzer Army as it moved up to the Donets from the south. The other was the force which had crossed the Donets along the Lysychansk-Slavyansk line and was now striving to shift its main effort to its western wing on both sides of the Krivoy Torets. 1st Panzer Army, which was liable to be enveloped from both flanks, had to try to tackle the 2 groups of enemy successively. The army group's own view was that it should deliver the first punch on its western wing and dispatch the enemy at Slavyansk before turning on the force at Voroshilovgrad. Unfortunately, the army had initially been compelled to tie up part of its forces with the latter group, with the result that it was no longer strong enough to beat the enemy at Slavyansk. This in turn meant that there could not be enough forces south of Voroshilovgrad to block the enemy's thrust to the southwest. As is so often the case in times of crisis, the large-scale emergencies were intensified by irritations of a localized character. On the basis of reconnaissance carried out before it dispatched 40 Panzer Corps to destroy the enemy force advancing from Slavyansk, 1st Panzer Army had decided that it was impossible for tanks to outflank the enemy over the ground west of the Krivoy Torets, because the deep fissures crisscrossing this particular stretch of country were buried in snow. Consequently, 40 Panzer Corps put in its attack more or less frontally, along and eastwards of the river valley. As the intense cold of the Russian winter makes it virtually impossible for troops to remain in the open country at night, most of the fighting inevitably took place around the inhabited localities in the Krivoy Torets valley, the first main objective being possession of the big factory town of Kramatorskaya. In a battle of this kind, however, there was no hope of gaining the quick decision we so urgently needed against the enemy force at Slavyansk, and 11 Panzer Division, which was leading the attack, progressed only with great difficulty. While the army group's intention of cutting the enemy off from the Donets by enveloping him from the west had thus been rendered nugatory, the latter pushed a strong force of armour through the allegedly impassable country west of the Krivoy Torets on the night of 11th of February, penetrating as far as Grishino. Once again it was seen that the Western conception of impassability had only limited validity where the Russians are concerned. partly, of course, because the wider tracks of Soviet armoured vehicles made it considerably easier for them to negotiate the mud or deep snow which held up our own tanks. At Grishino, the enemy was now not only deep in the flank of 1st Panzer Army, but also blocking the Army Group's main railway line from Dnepropetrovsk to Krasnoarmeyskoye. Only the railway through Zaporozhye remained open, and even in this case efficiency was reduced by the fact that the big Dnieper bridge destroyed by the enemy in 1941 was still not open to traffic. As a result, all goods had to be reloaded, and tank wagons carrying petrol could not go through to the front. While supplies to the battlefront, especially petrol, were thus endangered, and 1st Panzer Army was faced with the threat of being outflanked from the west, the enemy simultaneously tried to turn its flank from the east with the forces which had broken through by way of Voroshilovgrad. In particular, one enemy cavalry corps had managed to penetrate as far as the important rail junction of Debaltsevo, which lay not only far to the rear of the army's right wing, but even behind the position due to be occupied by Army Detachment Holit on the Mius. Although it was possible to surround this corps at Debaltsevo, its destruction proved a difficult and lengthy business on account of the tough resistance it put up in the villages. As a result, 17 Panzer Division, which was urgently required on the army's western wing, remained tied down here for the time being. On the eastern front, Soviet armoured forces, just back from a rest and refit, pressed hard behind Army Detachment Holit as it fell back on the Mius. As a result, we were temporarily unable to pull out the armoured divisions still with the Army Detachment. The Army Detachment did nonetheless succeed in reaching the Mius positions on 17th February and in organising a defence there. On the western wing, it had meanwhile proved possible to halt the enemy armour at Grishino by throwing in the Viking Division as it arrived from the Don. The latter was unable to dispose of the enemy with any speed, however. Apart from having been considerably weakened in the recent heavy fighting, it was suffering from an acute shortage of officers. The division was composed of SS volunteers from the Baltic and Nordic countries, and its losses had been so severe that there were no longer enough officers available with a command of the appropriate languages. Naturally enough, this had an adverse effect on the fighting efficiency of what was intrinsically a useful body of troops. In the meantime, 4th Panzer Army was still moving by road and rail from the lower Don to the western wing, its progress being considerably delayed by the bad state of the roads. Thus, apart from the fact that the enemy was already in 1st Panzer Army's deep flank at Grishino and able to send in fresh forces to reinforce those temporarily held up there, the danger in the yawning gap between the left wing of 1st Panzer Army and the Kharkov region remained as desperate as ever. In this area, the enemy had complete freedom of action. These critical developments in the Army Group's own area were primarily the result of the excessive length of time it had had to leave its forces forward on the Don and Donets to cover the withdrawal of Army Group A. Henceforth, our headquarters also watched Army Group B's sector with growing alarm. The enemy was capable, while ensuring that he was covered in the direction of Kharkov, of moving down on Pavlograd with the forces reported to be advancing westwards from Izium. From Pavlograd, he could go on to the Dnieper crossings of Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, thereby severing the Army Group's communications across the river. He could, moreover, try to overrun Army Detachment Lance, which was still in the process of assembling. If he succeeded, his way across the Dnieper would be open on both sides of Kremenchug, and he would subsequently be able to block the approaches to the Crimea and the Dnieper crossing at Kherson. The result would be the encirclement of the entire German southern wing. Even if the onset of the muddy season, which usually came about the end of March, were to interrupt such a far-reaching operation, the enemy could still be expected to continue pursuing this objective once it was over. In the light of these reflections, I sent OKH a fresh appreciation of the situation on 12th of February for submission to Hitler. Basing myself on the operational considerations outlined above, I laid special emphasis on 2 points. First, the ratio of forces. I pointed out that although the enemy had quite obviously been trying for almost 3 months past to precipitate matters on the Eastern Front by either demolishing or isolating our southern wing, the distribution of forces on our own side still took not the least account of this fact. Even if one allowed for the large number of divisions which had been sent to Don Army Group in recent months, the ratio of German to Soviet forces here and in Army Group B was still at least 1.8, whereas in the case of Central and Northern Army Groups it stood at 1.4. Now it was quite understandable that OKH should hesitate to create new crisis spots by taking forces away from these two army groups. Furthermore, OKH had probably been quite right when it pointed out, in reply to previous representations from me on the subject, that almost the whole of the available replacements of troops and weapons were being sent to Don Army Group, as a result of which the fighting potential of Central and Northern Army Groups was lower than our own. To all this, however, we could retort that the divisions of Don Army Group had been involved in incessant and very heavy fighting for months on end, which was not so in the case of the two army groups in the north. Besides, our divisions were fighting in open country, while Central and Northern Army Groups were established in timbered dugouts. The crucial factor, in any case, was that the enemy's decisive effort was directed not against the central or northern sectors of the German armies, but against their southern wing, and that it was inadmissible that we should continue to be left at such a numerical disadvantage. It could be taken for granted that even if we succeeded in averting the danger of being cut off from the Dnieper crossings, the enemy would still not lose sight of his more far-reaching aim of destroying the southern wing by surrounding it on the sea coast. For this reason, there must at all costs be a radical improvement in the ratio of forces on the German southern wing, even if it involved making concessions on other parts of the front or in other theatres of war. In addition to ventilating this fundamental question of the overall distribution of forces, I also stated my views to OKH on the subsequent conduct of operations on the German southern wing. This will be dealt with in the chapter on Operation Citadel. During the night of 12th of February, the army group, which had meanwhile been renamed Southern Army Group, moved its headquarters to Zaporozhye with a view to having the best possible control of the battle at what would shortly become the decisive spot. On the night of 13th of February, a directive was received from OKH, which was obviously the sequel to my proposals of 9th of February. It ruled, in accordance with these proposals, that a new army should deploy on the line Poltava-Dnepropetrovsk and another behind the southern wing of Second Army. In the event, however, neither army was ever formed. The one which was due to deploy behind Second Army did not arrive at all. While Second Army did receive a few reinforcements, they were given to it at the cost of those promised to ourselves. The army which was to deploy on the line Poltava-Dnepropetrovsk was Army Detachment Lance, already committed at Kharkov. It was subsequently placed under the command of Southern Army Group, together with the sector of Army Group B, inclusive of Belgorod. Second Army went over to Central Army Group, and HQ, Army Group B, was finally withdrawn from the Eastern Front order of battle. And so, around the middle of February 1943, the acute crisis in the area of Southern Army Group reached a new climax. With it, the danger that the entire southern wing of armies would be encircled by an extensive flanking movement from the neighbouring sector in the north threatened to take shape sooner or later. And yet, paradoxically, it was in this very culmination of the crisis that the germs of a counterstroke lay. Initially, however, the picture became gloomier still. It was undoubtedly a hazardous step to withdraw Army Group B at this particular moment from command at the cleft in the front. Although, apart from Second Army, it now had nothing but the battered remains of various units at its disposal, it still constituted an essential link in the chain of command on the Eastern Front. Its removal was bound to cause the front to burst open at the seam between Central and Southern Army Groups. In point of fact, moreover, HQ Southern Army Group could not yet assume command of the Kharkov sector now apportioned to it, i.e. that held by Army Detachment Lands, as no signal links had been established. Before we could take over, Kharkov was due to be lost. The fact that the takeover could take place as quickly as it did was due to the consistently high performance of the Army Group Signals Regiment and the purposeful way in which our chief signals officer, General Müller, handled our communications. As usual, we got liberal assistance from my friend General Feldgiebel, the chief of the Corps of Signals. But although the removal of HQ Army Group B complicated the handling of operations at the most delicate spot on the Eastern Front, it still served one useful purpose. By bringing Army Detachment Lance under Southern Army Group, it enabled our headquarters to exercise exclusive command at the decisive place and the decisive time. In effect, this contributed substantially to the final success of the winter campaign of 1942-3. Meanwhile, the Kharkov area was to become a fresh source of anxiety for the Army Group, even if Army Group B, or rather Hitler, by dint of his personal interventions, remained in command there for a few days yet. Army Detachment Lance had been ordered by Hitler to hold Kharkov at all costs, which now threatened to become a prestige issue like Stalingrad before it. With the object of relieving the pressure on Southern Army Group's left flank, moreover, the Army Detachment was to thrust in the direction of Losovaya with the SS Panzer Corps as its nucleus. Of the latter's 3 armoured divisions, there were still only 2 to hand. Clearly, the Army Detachment could fulfill only one of these 2 tasks with the forces at its command. It could either fight around Kharkov or else lend a hand on the left wing of Southern Army Group. I, therefore, suggested to Hitler that Army Detachment Lance should forego Kharkov for the time being, and try instead to beat the enemy south of the city. By this means, the danger of the army groups being enveloped across the Dnieper on both sides of Kremenchug would be temporarily eliminated. On the other hand, it was reasonable to suppose that by throwing in 4th Panzer Army, we could cope on our own with the enemy making for the Dnieper crossings at Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk. Once Lance had dealt with the enemy south of Kharkov, he could turn his attention to recapturing the city. This solution, however, did not suit Hitler, for whom Kharkov, as the 4th biggest city in the Soviet Union, had already become a symbol of prestige, and on 13th February he again passed a strict order to Army Detachment Lance through Army Group B to hold Kharkov at all costs. Thereupon I demanded to be informed by OKH whether this order would remain in force after Lance had come under my own command, and whether we should adhere to it even if the SS Panzer Corps were threatened with encirclement in Kharkov. I also requested an answer to the general appreciation which I had sent to Lützen the previous day. In reply, General Zeitzler told me that Hitler had described it as much too far-reaching. To this I retorted that I considered it only right for an army group to think 4 to 8 weeks ahead, unlike the Supreme Command, which never seemed to look any further than the next 3 days. As for the situation at Kharkov, circumstances proved stronger than Hitler's will. The SS Panzer Corps, which really was in danger of being surrounded there, evacuated the city on 15th February, incidentally against the orders of General Lance. This accomplished fact was reported to us by Army Group B, which finally relinquished its command about this time. Had the evacuation of Kharkov been ordered by a general of the army, Hitler would undoubtedly have had him court-martialed. But because this action had, quite rightly, been taken by the SS Panzer Corps, nothing of the sort occurred. All the same, the commander of Army Detachment Lance was replaced a few days later by General Kempf on the grounds that Lance was a mountaineer, while Kempf was a tank specialist. While the situation around Kharkov was manifestly deteriorating during the period in which Army Group B handed over the area to Southern Army Group, the possibility of the latter's being cut off from its communications across the Dnieper also became acute. It was reported on 10th of February that the enemy, as we had been expecting him to do for some time past, was advancing in strength towards Pavlograd and Dnepropetrovsk from the area west of Isium. If he succeeded in reaching Losovaya Junction or Pavlograd, or alternatively the station of Sinsinikovo hard to the southwest of Pavlograd, the railway link through Poltava would be severed. At the same time, the speed of arrival of the reinforcements promised by OKH slackened off again. Instead of the scheduled 37 troop trains per day, only 6 had come through on 14th February. Furthermore, Central Army Group announced that at present it lacked the necessary forces to make any serious attempt to cooperate with Southern Army Group along the line of cleavage between us. Apparently, it would be more than happy if it succeeded in halting Second Army, which was falling back into a concavity that already extended far west of Kursk. The situation had become so critical that Hitler decided to visit me at my headquarters. Presumably, my various comments had set him thinking. Much as I welcomed the prospect of putting my views to him personally and of letting him see the seriousness of our position for himself, it was naturally difficult to guarantee his safety in a sizable factory town like Zaporozhye, on which the enemy was advancing, particularly as he had expressed the intention of staying for some days. He and his suite, which included the Chief of the General Staff and General Jodl, and, as usual, his private cook, were accommodated in our office building, the whole vicinity of which had to be hermetically sealed off. Even then, the situation was not very reassuring, for Hitler's arrival had not passed unnoticed. As he drove into Zaporozhye from the airfield, he was recognized by soldiers and party officials in the streets. Practically the only troops we had available were our own defense company and a few anti-aircraft units, and before long enemy tanks were to get so close to the town that they could have fired at the airfield lying east of the Dnieper. Hitler arrived at my headquarters at noon on 17th of February. I began by giving him the following review of the situation. Army Detachment Hollet had reached the Mius positions that same day, closely pursued by the enemy. 1st Panzer Army had halted the enemy at Grishino, but not yet finished him off. In the Kramatorskaya area, likewise, the battle against the enemy forces which had come over the Lysychansk-Slavyansk line was still undecided. Army Detachment Lance, having evacuated Kharkov, had withdrawn southwest towards the Mosh sector. I then went on to inform Hitler of my intention to take the SS Panzer Corps right out of Kharkov, leaving only the balance of Army Detachment Lance in occupation. The SS Panzer Corps was to thrust southeastwards from the Krasnograd area in the general direction of Pavlograd, thereby coming into concert with 4th Panzer Army as it moved up there. The job of these forces would be to smash the enemy advancing through the broad gap between 1st Panzer Army and Army Detachment Lance. As soon as this had been achieved and there was no further danger that Army Detachment Hollet and 1st Panzer Army would be cut off, we should proceed to attack in the Kharkov area.